At the beginning of the 17th century, London was a city in constant motion, shaped by deep contrasts and driven by an almost uncontrollable energy. Anyone walking through its streets at that time would not encounter the orderly, monumental image that defines the English capital today, but rather a living, chaotic, and noisy organism where wealth and misery existed side by side, often separated by just a few meters. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of coal smoke, waste dumped into the streets, and a persistent dampness that seemed to cling to the city without ever leaving. Most houses, built primarily of wood, leaned precariously toward one another, forming narrow corridors through which sunlight barely managed to pass. Below, a ceaseless crowd pressed forward each day, made up of merchants, apprentices, sailors, nobles, beggars, and travelers from every corner of the kingdom. London was already one of the largest cities in Europe and was growing at a rapid pace. By the 1600s, its population was approaching 500,000 inhabitants, an extraordinary figure for the time. This expansion, however, took place without urban planning, without proper sanitation, and without any infrastructure capable of keeping up with such growth. Epidemics, fires, and social unrest were constant threats, always present in the daily lives of its residents. At the center of this intense urban life stood an element without which London simply could not function: the River Thames. The Thames was far more than a river. It was the city's main artery, the fastest, most efficient, and most reliable means of transportation in a London whose streets were narrow, congested, and often impassable. While crossing the city by land could take hours, traveling along the river allowed for quicker and more predictable movement, making it indispensable both for commerce and everyday life. Large volumes of goods passed through its waters each day. Coal, essential for heating homes and fueling ovens, arrived by river. Timber for construction, textiles, wool, leather, and food from rural regions also depended on the Thames to reach the city's markets. At the same time, English products were carried downstream toward foreign ports, connecting London to a commercial network that stretched across Europe. But it was not only goods that moved along the Thames. People from every social class used the river as a means of transportation. Nobles and members of the court preferred to travel in private, richly decorated vessels to avoid the chaos of the streets. Merchants crossed the river daily to conduct their business. Workers, apprentices, and messengers relied on barges to carry out their tasks. Even the poorest inhabitants, when possible, turned to the river as a faster and cheaper alternative. In this sense, the Thames made no distinctions. It served everyone and connected the entire city regardless of the social position of those who used it. Despite its vital importance, however, the river was far from clean or safe. Without organized sewer systems, the population discharged household waste and human refuse directly into its waters. Artisan workshops dumped production remnants into the river, while slaughterhouses released blood and entrails, turning the Thames into an increasingly polluted environment. On hot days, the stench was suffocating, and the dark, murky water became a constant breeding ground for disease. Even so, the city continued to depend on it. The Thames was, at the same time, a source of life and a source of illness, a contradiction that perfectly symbolized London itself during that period. At the heart of this pulsating river rose one of the city's most impressive and peculiar structures, London Bridge. Unlike a simple crossing, it functioned as an entire neighborhood suspended over the water. Along its length, multi-story houses stood side by side, many of them jutting dangerously out over the river below. At street level, shops, workshops, and small markets operated, while above them entire families lived, watching the constant movement beneath their windows day after day. London Bridge was never empty. During the day it was crowded with merchants, shoppers, workers, and travelers. At night it remained lit by torches and lanterns, with the constant sound of footsteps, voices, and carts echoing between the buildings. It was one of the busiest places in the city, a center of commerce and social life, but also of constant danger. While the bridge teemed with life above, below it posed a serious challenge for boatmen. Its narrow piers created violent currents and dangerous whirlpools that made navigation extremely difficult. Many boats capsized while attempting to pass through, others became trapped, and some simply vanished into the turbulent waters. Navigating beneath London Bridge required skill, experience, and courage. and it was not uncommon for boatmen to charge higher fees to take on the risk. Even so, the bridge was considered far too essential to be removed. It was an inseparable part of the city's economy and identity, a symbol of medieval London that endured despite its obvious dangers. During certain winters, when the cold became particularly severe, the Thames revealed an even more surprising face. In periods known as the Little Ice Age, temperatures dropped so dramatically that the river froze completely. When this happened, London experienced something extraordinary. The river, once a waterway for transport, transformed into a vast public square of ice. People walked across its frozen surface, stalls were set up, merchants sold food, hot drinks, and small goods, while musicians and performers entertained the crowds. These celebrations became known as the Frost Fairs and attracted residents from across the city, as well as curious visitors. It was a rare moment of festivity amid a routine defined by constant hardship. Even then, danger was never absent. The ice was not always stable, and accidents occurred. Some people fell into the freezing water and did not survive. Still, the risk was accepted, because in London, life had always meant living alongside danger. The River Thames, with all its importance, filth, beauty, and threat, shaped the rhythm of the city and the lives of its inhabitants. It was the axis around which London organized itself, grew, and survived. Without the Thames, London in the 1600s simply would not have existed. But the river was only the beginning. Around it rose symbols of absolute power, imposing palaces, political centers, and institutions that determined the fate of the kingdom. To truly understand what London was like during this period, one must move beyond the river and enter the spaces where authority, religion, and politics were inseparably intertwined. To truly understand what London was like in the 17th century, it is not enough to observe its crowded streets or the relentless flow of the River Thames. One must look to the places where power was concentrated, where decisions were made, sentences were pronounced, and the fate of thousands of people could change irreversibly. London was not merely a commercial city, it was the political, military, and spiritual heart of England, and this reality was clearly reflected in its most emblematic buildings. Among them all, none symbolized royal authority and state control more powerfully than the Tower of London. Rising along the banks of the Thames, the tower dominated the urban landscape as a constant and intimidating presence. For those arriving in the city by river, it was one of the first structures to impose itself on the horizon, reminding everyone that the power of the crown was absolute and ever watchful. Over the centuries, the tower had accumulated multiple functions, and by the 1600s it continued to serve simultaneously as a fortress, a military arsenal, a treasury, and a prison. Its thick walls and imposing towers protected weapons, valuable documents, and above all, people deemed too dangerous for the order of the realm. Traitors, conspirators, disgraced nobles, and political opponents passed through its gates, often unsure whether they would ever emerge again. For the people of London, the tower was not merely a historic building, it was a constant reminder that power could be ruthless. Around it, stories of executions, torture, and conspiracies spread from mouth to mouth, fueling both fear and curiosity. Although public executions usually took place elsewhere in the city, the tower remained deeply associated with the idea of ultimate punishment and absolute control. To be imprisoned there meant that the full attention of the state had turned directly upon you. Yet London was not governed by fear alone. There were also centers where power was exercised through politics, religion, and ritual, and no place represented this more clearly than Westminster. Located to the west of the old medieval city, Westminster formed a distinct core, almost a city within a city. It was here that institutions took shape which would profoundly influence England's future. The Palace of Westminster, home to Parliament, grew increasingly important throughout the 17th century, especially as tensions mounted between the monarchy and the representatives of the people. Although the king still held much of the power, Parliament was beginning to challenge that authority, questioning taxes, military decisions, and the very limits of royal rule. These conflicts, which would later erupt into civil wars and lead to profound changes in England's political system, were already present beneath the surface in London during the 1600s. Westminster was therefore not merely an administrative center, but a space where the future of the nation was being quietly contested. Beside Parliament stood Westminster Abbey, one of the most important religious buildings in the kingdom. Far more than a church, the abbey served as the stage for royal coronations, the funerals of monarchs, and ceremonies that reinforced the connection between divine authority and earthly power. Every stone of the abbey carried centuries of tradition, and its imposing presence strengthened the belief that the king's authority was sanctioned by God. For the ordinary citizen, Westminster represented a mixture of reverence, distance, and mystery. Few people had direct access to these spaces, yet everyone felt the impact of the decisions made within them. Laws, taxes, and decrees that shaped daily life were born in that center of power. Scattered throughout the city and its surroundings, royal palaces completed this landscape of authority and splendor. Unlike the fixed image of a single central palace, the English monarchy of the 17th century moved frequently, using different residences throughout the year. Among them, the vast complex of the Palace of Whitehall stood out. Whitehall was, in practice, the main administrative heart of the monarchy. Its sprawling complex stretched along the banks of the Thames and housed not only royal apartments, but also offices, audience chambers, and the residences of courtiers. It was a place of constant activity, where diplomats, nobles, officials, and servants circulated daily, forming a true palatial city within London itself. Whitehall's proximity to the river was no coincidence. Like the rest of the city, the court relied on the Thames for swift and discreet transportation. Royal barges arrived and departed frequently, avoiding the chaotic streets and ensuring greater security. Another important residence was the Palace of Richmond, located farther from the crowded urban center. It served as a kind of refuge for the royal family, especially during periods of intense heat or when the pollution and odors of the city became unbearable. Richmond offered cleaner air, expansive gardens, and a sense of distance from the urban turmoil, something increasingly valued as London expanded without restraint. During this same period, Buckingham House was not yet the iconic palace known today. It was a noble residence of lesser importance, situated in a more open area, away from the congested center. Only centuries later would it become the primary symbol of the British monarchy. But even in the 1600s, its presence hinted at the gradual expansion of the city beyond its medieval boundaries. These centers of power did not exist in isolation from urban life. On the contrary, they directly shaped the daily experience of the population. The presence of the court attracted artisans, merchants, servants, and service providers, generating wealth while simultaneously intensifying overcrowding. At the same time, political decisions made within palaces and grand halls quickly echoed through the streets, influencing prices, taxes, labor, and even the city's food security. London in the 1600s was a city where power was visibly inscribed into the landscape. Fortresses, churches, and palaces constantly reminded its inhabitants who ruled, who decided, and who ultimately paid the price for those decisions. Daily life unfolded in the shadow of imposing walls and centuries-old institutions, creating a permanent tension between authority and survival. That tension became even more evident when one turned attention to the lives of ordinary people, especially in commercial and residential districts where overcrowding, poverty, and constant risk defined everyday existence. To understand how most Londoners lived, one must descend from these centers of power and walk through the narrow streets, noisy markets, and densely packed neighborhoods that sustained the city. While palaces, fortresses, and the halls of Westminster concentrated decisions that shaped the fate of the kingdom, the true London pulsed through the narrow, congested streets where most of the population lived. It was there, far from the luxury of the court, that the city's real daily life revealed itself, marked by relentless labor, constant improvisation, and a daily struggle for survival. London's rapid expansion had created a problem that was impossible to ignore: overcrowding. Thousands of people arrived in the city each year, drawn by the promise of work, trade, and opportunities that simply did not exist in the countryside. The city, however, was unprepared to receive them. The result was chaotic growth, with houses built ever closer together, often without any concern for safety or hygiene. The streets were narrow, winding, and frequently cast in shadow by buildings that nearly touched above. In many neighborhoods, the space between houses was so limited that a cart could barely pass through. Sunlight rarely reached the ground, and dampness lingered constantly, creating an environment ripe for disease. The risk of fire was ever present, as most structures were made of wood with thatched roofs or equally flammable materials. This extreme density made urban life feel claustrophobic. Noise was constant, made up of footsteps, vendors shouting, the pounding of workshop tools, horses neighing, and the creak of cartwheels grinding over uneven ground. London never seemed to sleep completely. Even at night, taverns remained open, lit by candles and oil lamps as groups gathered to drink, talk, or negotiate. At the heart of this frenetic daily life was commerce, and few places represented it more clearly than Cheapside. Located in the center of the medieval city, Cheapside was London's main commercial street, a true economic artery where shops, stalls, and workshops of every kind clustered together. Almost anything could be bought there. Fine fabrics, jewelry, food, spices, household goods, and imported products from distant lands. Cheapside was not merely a place of buying and selling. It was also a social and political stage. Ceremonial processions passed through it, displaying the power of the monarchy and the craft guilds. At the same time, the street was often filled with protests, arguments, and clashes, driven by the religious and political tensions that divided the city. Catholics, Protestants, and rival factions competed for influence, and these rivalries became most visible in the busiest public spaces. The constant proximity between wealth and poverty only intensified these tensions. On the same street, one could find elegant shops frequented by prosperous merchants and, just a few steps away, narrow alleys where entire families lived crowded together in precarious conditions. Many residents shared a single room with several others, sleeping in shifts and surviving on minimal resources. Hygiene was a serious problem. Without efficient sewer systems, household waste was often dumped directly into the streets or into makeshift pits. On rainy days, water mixed with mud, garbage, and human waste, turning the ground into a foul-smelling mire. Diseases spread easily, and epidemics were regarded almost as an unavoidable part of urban life. Even so, London continued to grow. For many, these harsh conditions were still preferable to rural poverty or hunger in the countryside. The city offered work, even if unstable, in workshops, ports, markets, and services connected to the court. Children worked from an early age as apprentices, street vendors, or helpers, while women found ways to survive through domestic labor, informal trade, or small-scale craft production. Taverns played a central role in social life. They served as meeting points, places of rest, and spaces where information circulated rapidly. News of parliamentary decisions, rumors about the court, crime stories, and travelers' accounts were shared in these noisy environments, creating an informal network of communication that connected the entire city. This intense daily life, defined by extreme proximity, constant risk, and continuous adaptation, made London both resilient and vulnerable at the same time. Overcrowding, the widespread use of wood, and the constant presence of fire for heating and lighting formed a dangerous combination, leaving the city particularly susceptible to major catastrophes. That structural fragility, built up over decades of uncontrolled growth, would reveal itself in devastating fashion in the middle of the 17th century. The same urban environment that allowed London to prosper economically was also preparing the stage for one of the most traumatic events in its history. In that overcrowded urban environment, where wooden houses leaned against one another and fire was part of daily life for cooking, heating, and lighting, London existed in a constant state of vulnerability. A single uncontrolled spark, a forgotten oven, or a fallen candle was enough to signal disaster. For decades, small fires had been common, quickly contained or simply accepted as part of the risk of living in the city. In September of 1666, however, this ever-present threat would reach a scale never seen before. In the early hours of a Sunday morning, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane, a narrow street in the eastern part of the city. What began as a small blaze quickly found the perfect conditions to spread. Wooden buildings, flammable roofs, and the extreme closeness of structures allowed the flames to advance with astonishing speed. Strong winds drove the fire from house to house, turning entire streets into corridors of flame. Early attempts to contain the fire were chaotic and ineffective. London had no organized fire brigade, and the methods available were crude. Buckets of water were passed from hand to hand as desperate residents tried to save what they could before fleeing. In many cases, houses themselves were torn down in an effort to create fire breaks, but the speed of the flames rendered these efforts largely futile. As the fire spread, panic seized the population. Entire families abandoned their homes carrying only a few belongings while streets filled with people in flight. The sky darkened not only from smoke, but from the collective sense that the city was losing control of its own fate. The heat was intense, and contemporary accounts describe stones cracking and metals melting under the force of the flames. For days, the fire continued to advance, consuming whole neighborhoods and destroying a significant portion of medieval London. Churches, markets, houses, and workshops vanished in the inferno. Among the most symbolic losses was the old St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the city's most important religious landmarks. Its destruction represented not only a material loss, but a profound blow to the collective imagination, as if London's very identity were being consumed by fire. When the flames finally began to subside, the scene was one of devastation. Much of the city center had been reduced to rubble. Thousands were left homeless, and the urban landscape was nearly unrecognizable. Yet, despite the scale of destruction, the number of recorded deaths was surprisingly low, a fact that continues to puzzle historians. The most widely accepted explanation is that most residents managed to escape in time, abandoning their homes before the fire reached them. The psychological impact of the fire was immense. For many Londoners, the event was interpreted as divine punishment or as a sign that something was deeply wrong with the city and the kingdom itself. Religious sermons multiplied in an attempt to make sense of the tragedy, while rumors and theories spread through the streets. Foreigners and minority groups were even accused of deliberately starting the fire, revealing how fear and uncertainty fueled suspicion and prejudice. At the same time, the destruction created an unexpected opportunity. With much of the city reduced to ashes, it became possible to rethink London in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Authorities began to discuss reconstruction plans that included wider streets, improved urban organization, and the use of less flammable materials. Although many of these ambitious proposals were never fully implemented due to costs and practical urgency, the fire marked the beginning of a significant transformation. Reconstruction brought visible changes. Wood was gradually replaced by brick and stone in many areas, reducing the risk of future large-scale fires. New urban regulations were introduced in an effort to impose some degree of order on the city's growth. St. Paul's Cathedral itself would be rebuilt, this time with a monumental design that symbolized not only faith, but London's ability to reinvent itself after catastrophe. This reconstruction did not immediately erase the hardships of urban life. Overcrowding, poverty, and sanitation problems continued to affect much of the population. Even so, the Great Fire of 1666 served as a turning point, a moment when the city was forced to confront its vulnerabilities and seek ways to survive in the future. The London that emerged from the ashes was not entirely new, but it bore the deep scars of everything that had been lost. Rebuilt streets, redesigned buildings, and new urban rules reflected an attempt to balance tradition with change. The city remained noisy, unequal, and often dangerous, but there was now a greater awareness that uncontrolled growth had its limits. In the years that followed, these transformations would help shape modern London, a city built upon layers of destruction and adaptation. The chaos of the 1600s, with its polluted rivers, overcrowded streets, imposing centers of power, and devastating fires, did not fade from collective memory. Instead, it became part of London's identity, a constant reminder that the city had always survived by reinventing itself. This capacity for adaptation, forged amid crises and conflict, is perhaps the greatest legacy of 17th-century London, a city that grew without control, faced fire, disease, and fear, and yet continued to move forward, turning each tragedy into a new chapter of its history. When observing London throughout the 17th century, it becomes clear that the city was not shaped by a single event, but by a succession of constant pressures that accumulated day after day. Uncontrolled growth, absolute dependence on the River Thames, the concentration of political and religious power, extreme overcrowding, and ultimately the devastation caused by the Great Fire combined to create a city that lived perpetually on the edge between prosperity and collapse. London was, at the same time, a center of opportunity and a place of permanent risk. For many, the city represented the chance for work, trade, and social advancement. For others, it was a hostile environment where disease, hunger, and insecurity were part of everyday life. This duality defined the urban experience and helps explain why London attracted so many inhabitants, despite offering such harsh conditions. The 17th century marked a crucial turning point. A city that had grown without planning began, slowly but unmistakably, to recognize its own limits. The changes imposed by Reconstruction after the fire did not solve every problem, but they made it clear that London needed to adapt in order to survive. The use of new materials, efforts toward urban organization, and the widening of certain streets signaled an attempt to learn from the recent past. At the same time, centers of power continued to exert enormous influence over the city's fate. Decisions made at Westminster, the symbols of authority embodied by the Tower of London, and the constant presence of the monarchy shaped not only the politics of the kingdom, but also the daily lives of its inhabitants. Taxes, laws, religious conflicts, and political disputes echoed directly through the streets, markets, and overcrowded homes where most of the population lived. The River Thames remained the thread connecting all of these elements. Even polluted and dangerous, it continued to be essential to the city's functioning, sustaining trade, transportation, and communication. London grew around it, suffered because of it, and survived thanks to it. Its constant presence served as a reminder that the city depended on natural forces as much as on human decisions. Over time, the experiences of the 17th century left deep marks. The memory of the fire, of epidemics, and of urban hardship became part of London's identity. These memories influenced how the city developed in the centuries that followed, contributing to the creation of a London that was more resilient, more organized, and gradually more aware of its own complexity. Modern London cannot be understood without this turbulent past. Every widened street, every stone building, and every established institution carries echoes of a city that had to learn how to survive amid chaos. The 17th century was not merely a period of crisis, but a decisive moment that set the course of the English capital. And so, when we look at London today, it is impossible to ignore that its strength and influence were born precisely from the hardships it endured throughout its history. The city of the 1600s, with all its disorder, danger, and vitality, became the foundation upon which one of the world's most important metropolises was built. A city that learned long ago that survival means constant reinvention, even when everything around it seems on the verge of collapse. If you've made it this far, you may have realized that every city holds layers of history rarely seen in books or postcards. London in the 1600s was just one of them, shaped by chaos, power, tragedy, and transformation. Now the question is, which city would you like us to explore next? It could be a European capital, a place forgotten by time, or a city shaped by decisive moments in history. Leave the name of the city and the period that sparks your curiosity in the comments, because this journey into the past continues with the choices of those who follow along.